So Silo is a show that takes place in a ruined and toxic future about a community that exists in a giant underground silo that plunges hundreds of stories deep. People there live in a society full of regulations that they believe are meant to protect them. But we have to dive into this mystery with the characters to hopefully discover the truth behind these regulations. So episode 1, titled Freedom Day, starts off with a flash-forward scene introducing us to Sheriff Holston, who's the sheriff of the silo. He's seen placing a vase of flowers on a table and unscrewing a vent before leaving his home. We see levels of cattle and agriculture as he narrates what they call the Pact, which is like their version of the Constitution, which reads, "We do not know why we are here. We do not know who built the silo. We do not know why everything outside the silo is as it is. We do not know when it will be safe to go outside. We only know that day is not this day." He can be seen in his office leaving behind a note to someone that says, "Double the flowers in front of the mirror," and we see him leaving his sheriff's badge behind. He leaves his office and tells Deputy Marnes that he's going to holding cell 3. He locks himself inside and stares out the window at someone's dead body near a tree. Marnes walks around the corner and then Sheriff Holston tells him that it's been 3 years and that he wants to see her. We find out that the body outside is his wife, who also requested to go out at an earlier time. Then Sheriff Holston says the magic words, which are, "I want to go out." If anyone in the silo says these 5 words, their request has to be honored, and afterwards they are sent outside in some kind of spacesuit. And as far as I remember, they can't take it back. They now have to be sent out. Then we jump to a flashback where we see Sheriff Holston and his wife Allison at a happier time. We see that they have received a message of approval for childbearing, which allows them to try to have a child for 1 year. It's also revealed that this is the 3rd time they've tried. In the next scene, as they walk through the cafeteria, everyone seems to be aware that it is now their turn to try to reproduce. When it's your turn to reproduce in the silo, everyone is aware. During this time, we are introduced to Gloria, who offers fertility counseling. Gloria knows that this is their 3rd time trying, and this is why she is approaching them again. But Sheriff Holston doesn't believe her because he feels like her services are fraud. Then we jump to the next scene where Allison is having her birth control removed, and it's some kind of futuristic-looking silver bullet that can only be surgically removed once it's time to reproduce. Immediately after this scene, we can see them wasting no time trying to get pregnant. In the next scene, we see Allison, who works in IT, who is approached by Bernard, who is the head of IT, who approaches her about an article she wrote about retrieving deleted files. Bernard seems to be very strict about allowing this information to be accessible to everyone in the silo. And this is sort of our first example of how strict leadership is in the silo. Later at home, Sheriff Holston questions Allison to see if she knew if she was breaking the rules. Allison admits to Holston that she knew that she was breaking the rules. She feels like there's too many rules, and she wants to know why it's wrong to ask questions. She goes on to explain how they blame the rebels for erasing their history and how it doesn't make sense for them to be punished if someone discovers a relic from the past, which they refer to as the before time. In this moment, Holston doesn't seem to share the same curiosity as Allison. He believes in the Pact and is a loyal follower who doesn't question the laws of judicial. So let me give you guys a quick rundown of what all of these terms are, starting with the rebels. The rebels are a group who wanted to rebel against the silo and go outside. We get a speech later in this episode and we find out more about the Day of the Rebellion, aka Freedom Day, and why the rebels were blamed for erasing their history. And now let me explain what relics are. So relics are items that existed above ground before humans migrated to the silo. This could be any normal item like a toy, comic book, or CD player, etc. Having modern-day items like these are not allowed in the silo and can lead to punishment like being sent to the mine. In the silo, less desirable jobs are at the bottom levels, and more important jobs like being a doctor or law enforcement, etc. are located on the upper levels. And this is the same for wealthier versus lower-class residents of the silo as well. And lastly, judicial is the top level of law in the silo. This is where all the laws are created, and they are the main enforcers of all the rules. Pretty much everyone in the silo is afraid of them. Alright, so next we see that Sheriff Holston and Allison are running out of time to conceive a child, and as Allison becomes more frustrated, Holston tries to keep hope alive. Then we cut to the next scene where we see Sheriff Holston and Deputy Marnes as they prepare for the Freedom Day celebration with Mayor Johns. In this moment, Mayor Johns mentions how it's becoming more difficult with the passing months to see out the window in the cafeteria. Sheriff Holston mentions how the dirty window is a good sign because this means that there hasn't been any cleanings. Mayor Johns responds by saying no one wants a cleaning, but it's important so people can see what it looks like outside. And FYI, a cleaning is when someone from the silo is exiled. because they broke the rule of saying that they wanted to go out, which is what we saw in the flash forward at the beginning of this episode with Sheriff Holston. Later, we see Gloria catching up with Allison, and she takes her back to her home, where she reveals to Allison that she knows that she is someone who wonders, which is basically someone who questions if what they're being told about the silo is true. Gloria tells Allison that she's turning on the water so they can't be heard, which reveals to us that someone is possibly able to spy on them inside their homes. Then she proceeds to ask Allison if she ever wonders if the rebels were actually the ones who burned the books, and why are they underground, and what actually happened out there. Then Gloria asked Allison one last big question, which was, does she really think that she is the kind of person that they want having children? This really makes you think, what does Gloria even really mean by this? Allison goes to Holston with her concerns regarding how Gloria might honestly just want to help, and how Gloria revealed to her that her and her husband were also unable to have a child, and she would like Sheriff Holston to investigate. But Holston reassures Allison that they have just as much of a chance of having a child as everyone else in the silo, and that Gloria is crazy, and she should just mind her own business. Later, during the Freedom Day celebration, Allison is called into computer repair, where she meets George Wilkins, who is a pretty important character throughout the show. She finds out that he read her article on deleted files that was removed, and he called in for help on Freedom Day, hoping that he would get her specifically. She asked him why didn't he just ask for her specifically, and he tells her that he didn't want to raise suspicion with Judicial. George reveals to Allison that a guy brought him a hard drive a year ago, and that he hasn't been able to access the deleted files on it. He also tells her that he thinks the drive is more than 140 years old, which was before the rebellion, mainly because there is no record of the hard drive serial number in their logs, and he points out that the logs didn't start until after the rebellion. She tells him that that's impossible because all the drives were destroyed in the rebellion, but George has her attention and she jumps on the computer and tries to retrieve the files. We also find out that the drive has the number 18 on it, which currently doesn't mean anything to us, but it will later in the season. At this time, everyone else in the silo is celebrating Freedom Day. Like I said earlier, Freedom Day was the day the rebels rebelled against the silo because they wanted to go outside. It's believed that the rebels were stopped by the founders from opening the doors, but the rebels did succeed at burning all the books, computer drives, and shredded all the files. But we don't know if this story was true. Back at computer repair, George and Allison gain access to the files on the drive and discover all kinds of shit, but Allison gets frightened of getting caught and leave. During this time, we see that George discovers a door at the bottom of the silo that leads to some sort of underground tunnel. A little time passes, and Allison grows tired of not being able to get pregnant. She begins to go back to see Gloria, and eventually she also goes back to see George and tells him that she wants to see everything. While continuing to search through the drive with George, they end up discovering a file named Jane Carmody Cleaning, and inside is a video of what seems to be of the outside world, and it looks beautiful, which is nothing like what the residents of the silo can see outside their windows. After discovering this information, Allison decides to keep it to herself and doesn't inform Holston. Also, we find out their pregnancy opportunity time has ran out. In the next scene, we see Holston sitting with the doctor as they both wait for Allison to arrive. He goes to look for her and finds her back home, where she finally reveals to him how they don't want them to have children. She also shows him that her birth control was never removed and how she removed it herself so she'd have proof to show him. But because she removed it, she actually injured herself pretty bad. Holston runs to get Dr. Leonard, but on the way back he finds out from Sheriff Marnes that Allison is now in the cafeteria, where she's basically telling everyone there that they are all being lied to. She tells everyone there that the display is a lie and how it is actually okay for them to go outside. Holston shows up to the cafeteria and is unsuccessful at trying to talk her down, and eventually she yells that she wants to go outside. Holston, Deputy Marnes, and Mayor Johns tries to save Allison by trying to find a way to prove that Allison was possibly misled by someone or misheard. So law enforcement goes after Gloria and George Wilkins to search for proof that they caused this event, but they are unsuccessful at discovering anything. Eventually, Sheriff Holston simply believes that not being able to have a baby is what drove Allison to do what she did. In the next scene, we see a new department in the silo where they are preparing a suit to send Allison outside. Back at Holding Cell 3, Allison tells Holston everything she knows about the truth she's uncovered, and she tells him that the windows aren't displaying how it truly looks outside, and how once she's outside, if it truly looks like what they see from inside, she won't clean. She tells Holston that she'll wave goodbye because she would have made the biggest mistake of her life, but if it turns out to be beautiful outside and not look like a wasteland, she will clean the sensors. and that's how he'll know it's truly beautiful outside. She tells him that she will proceed to walk over the hill, find out what's going on, and then she'll come back for him. In the silo, cleaning is like this ritual people tend to perform if they decide to leave. They clean the dust off the sensors so people gathered around in the cafeteria can see outside clearly. But Allison believes that people clean so they can truly show others what's really outside. And honestly, even cleaning itself is still pretty much a mystery to people in the silo. Here's where we get the full speech from the Pact read by Holston. The last part just talks about how the people of the silo hopes that the one who chooses to go outside will also choose to clean so everyone inside can see the world as it is. And he asked her if she had any last words, and she tells him that she loves him, and he says it back. Afterwards, Allison is then sent outside, where we can see that she does end up cleaning the sensors, which confirms to us that the display is a lie and that the world outside is beautiful. Everyone watches this from the cafeteria, along with Holston, who she specifically told this to. She then tries to walk over the hill, but unfortunately she collapses and dies before she makes it there. Later we find out that George Wilkins dies not long after Allison went outside. He fell off the edge in the silo somewhere around level 120, and it's a mystery on whether or not, if he was pushed. But someone believes that he was murdered, which we find out later that someone is Juliet Nichols. At the end of the episode, we finally jump back to the current day where Sheriff Holston is still behind bars. Deputy Marnes reveals that Sheriff Holston was basically dead inside for 2 years until he met Juliet, and Sheriff Holston responds by telling him that he finally started listening to what Allison was trying to tell him, and how now he just needs to go outside to know if that's really her outside or not, and to know the truth about what's out there. So episode 2 begins with showing us Sheriff Holston as he walks outside, and he can see that it looks beautiful and serene out there. Immediately his first thought is how Allison was right and how he needs to show this to the people of the silo. So he proceeds to clean, and the people of the silo begin to cheer. But not long after this, Sheriff Holston begins to stumble, and eventually he collapses and dies near his wife Allison. He also removed his helmet, and we can only see close-ups of him before he dies, which I personally think are important details to notice. At this time, we see Juliet in the Down Deep, aka the lowest level of residence in the silo, where we can see that she is extremely angry after Sheriff Holston's death. Next, we jump to Deputy Marnes and Mayor Johns as they discuss who's going to be appointed sheriff next. Normally, Deputy Marnes would become sheriff, but he reveals to the mayor that he plans to retire soon. Also, while paying a visit, Bernard expresses how he highly disagrees that the mayor should be considering Juliet as sheriff because she's a thief. He tells the mayor that she stole heat tape that they used to prevent the servers from overheating, but the mayor refuses to budge and wants to honor Holston's choice. Afterwards, Mayor Johns and Deputy Marnes stops on level 50 to speak with Juliet's father, Dr. Nichols, because they're curious as to why she lives down deep on level 144 when she was born in the mids on or around level 50. And if it wasn't obvious, the people who live within level 50 is the silo's equivalent of the upper middle to middle class. He tells them that her mother's death was hard on her, and that she wanted to go down deep when she was 13 because of her strong interest in machines. Later, Robert from Judicial shows up and tries to aggressively persuade the mayor to choose Paul, which is some random choice that they want to have in a position of power who's someone they can have control over, but Mayor Johns continues to refuse until she has met with Juliet. Throughout this episode, we can see that Juliet and the mechanical team have been making temporary repairs to the silo's generator to keep things running, but things are getting worse to the point where they will have to eventually stop the generator and the silo will have to be without power for a brief amount of time. Everyone is very concerned about doing this because they have never stopped the generator before, and they are all afraid that they may not be able to get the power to start back, which will leave them in darkness and chaos. At this time, the mayor meets with Martha, who we find out is an old friend. She tries to gain some more insight about what kind of person Juliet is, and it obviously must have went well because in the next scene she is offering Juliet the position of sheriff. Initially, Juliet declines the offer because she says that she needs to be down there to keep the generator running, but later she notices a carving on the back of the badge that Holston left for her, and it's not revealed until later, but she runs down Mayor Johns and tells her that she would like to take the job, but first she needs to repair the generator by turning it off and leaving everyone in darkness for 8 hours. When the generator was first powered down for a split second in the cafeterias in the silo, everyone could see a different display. It was that beautiful sunny weather that we had seen from Holston's point of view last episode. It was very strange, but it is something that we do get an answer to later. Luckily, Juliet and the mechanical team is able to successfully repair the generator. Then she says her goodbyes to Martha, and she also leaves the camcorder with her so she's able to figure out what kind of relic it is. Then she makes her way up top, and the episode ends with the shocking death of Mayor Johns, who it seems may have poisoned herself. Episode 4 begins with a flashback of Juliet's family, and we can see that her brother Jacob was very sick, but at this time we don't know what that sickness is. Back in current day, Juliet is called to join Deputy Marnes, Robert from Judicial, and Bernard, who was the head of IT. But ever since Mayor Johns was poisoned, Bernard is now the temporary mayor until elections are held and he's possibly sworn in. But in the meantime, he is continuing to honor Juliet's position as sheriff until she's also sworn in, which Juliet is sworn in later in the episode. Throughout this episode, Juliet is getting acclimated into her new position as sheriff, and we spend a lot of time jumping back and forth between current day and flashbacks from when she went down to mechanical at age 13. We find out that Juliet forged a letter from her father to go down to mechanical, and later he found out through Martha and allowed her to stay. Later in the episode, we also find out that Sheriff Holston left a note for Juliet that says, "Double the flowers in front of the mirror." We're not sure what this means yet, but Juliet did move into Holston's old apartment, and there is a vase of flowers on the table in front of a mirror. In this episode, Juliet meets Lucas, and we find out that Deputy Marnes and Mayor Johns were romantically involved, which was already pretty obvious. The episode ends with Martha getting the Relic camcorder to work, Deputy Marnes is attacked in his home, and Juliet finds George's files in Holston's vent. In episode 5, it's confirmed that Deputy Marnes was killed, and immediately Paul Billings was assigned as the new deputy. This is the guy Judicial originally wanted to be sheriff. Judicial and Mayor Bernard decide to come up with a story to not startle the residents by telling people that Marnes and Mayor Johns were both murdered. He instead blamed their deaths on heart issues from walking the silo. Later, they are both buried together to make it look like a tragic love story as a distraction. Juliet and Paul begin to investigate Marnes' death, and along the way, Juliet discovers rat poison and a drawing of Mayor Johns in Patrick Kennedy's apartment. We find out later that Douglas from Judicial was the one who planted the evidence in Kennedy's old apartment. Juliet discovered the truth, and Robert cleans up the mess by later killing Douglas, because we find out that Douglas was responsible for George, Mayor Johns, and Marnes' death as well. Also, Robert mentions after coming out of the janitorial closet that the people behind that door have the most important job in the silo, and no, he was not talking about the janitors, but we don't find out that part at this time. Juliet takes this information to Judicial, and they seem a little suspicious after she reveals to them that she solved the murders. Then she asked Mayor Bernard for a couple days off to retrieve some items from down deep and to say goodbyes. She goes to visit Martha, and we find out why the silo doesn't have elevators and how magnifying tools above a certain power are against the rules. They don't have elevators because they can't mechanize the way they travel up and down the silo using lifts and pulleys. That's also against the rules because it's in the pack. Also, Lucas in the cafeteria studies the lights in the sky and tells Juliet about them, but they don't know yet that the lights are called stars. And the episode ends with Juliet going back down to Dead Man's Hole to retrieve the candy dispenser relic. In episode 6, she takes the relic and plants it in Douglas's apartment as a reason why he killed Deputy Marnes. In a flashback, we find out that Juliet and George broke into Supply together to steal the tape that just keeps coming up throughout the show, and here is where we get a hint. And Juliet mentions that the tape saves lives. Later, she is granted permission by Judicial to investigate the relic she planted, which is the reason why she planted it in the first place, since it originally belonged to George. They also go by to see Regina, whose name came up after her, and Paul questioned Patrick while investigating George's death. Her name was mentioned for being someone who traded and sold illegal relics. But we also find out that her and George were also romantically involved, and he used her to get the relics he needed. Later, we see that Bernard puts an end to the investigation, and Paul finds out that Juliet planted it. She reveals to him that she knows he has the syndrome, and we don't know what the syndrome is at this time. But we find out that if you have it, it's against the rules to be law enforcement. During this time, Lucas in the cafeteria seems to be slowly becoming a new love interest for Juliet. She also begins to struggle on whether or not if she should continue to pursue the investigation, since George lied to Regina and just used her to get what he wanted. In a flashback with George, we see Juliet asking him about the questions he has regarding the silo, and reveals that the most important one is, what if everything they believe to be true is just one big lie? Then Juliet goes back to see Regina because she thinks that Regina was a confidential informant that told Judicial about George's possession of the hard drive. Regina begins to inform Juliet about a mysterious man that comes at night that knows about all the people she speaks to and how he's always listening to her somehow. She turns on a fan during their conversation to create noise and to make it harder for whoever is listening to hear them. Regina goes on to tell her that she gave Judicial all the relic dealers' names she knew after they sent her mom to work in the mines, and if I forgot to mention it, working in the mines is their way of basically torturing people in the silo, and they did this to Regina's mom so they could get answers out of Regina. We also find out during this time that Regina was the one who got the hard drive for George, but she wouldn't give it to him, so he traded something for it that originally was a gift from his mom. At the end of the episode, we find out that the gift was a kid's travel guide for the state of Georgia. We also find out that there is a camera inside the mirrors in their apartment, and there is a control center where everyone in the silo is under surveillance. This shit is more high-tech than anything we have seen in the silo so far, which lets us know that they do have modern-day technology. In episode 7, we see Gloria again and we find out that they have been drugging her in the silo to suppress her memories. We also discover that maintenance broke Juliet's vase, and we already know why they did that. It was so they could see past them since there are cameras in the mirrors. Juliet goes to question Gloria while watching out for the listeners, aka the friends of the silo, who are basically like secret snitches throughout the silo who can tell on you and you don't know who they are. She tries to take Gloria for a walk to get information out of her regarding the travel guide relic, but because of orders from Judge Meadows, she is unauthorized to do so. The romance between Juliet and Lucas seems to be growing, but it's pretty clear that she's seeing him as more of a rebound for George. Later, she meets with Mayor Bernard and he informs her that he thinks that Judge Meadows might try to get rid of him and hijack the IT servers to basically take control of the silo. He also tells Juliet that she needs to find something to keep Judge Meadows in check during her investigation so the judge doesn't try to overstep her boundaries and fires him and her. Afterwards, Juliet goes to see Judge Meadows to get authorization to speak to Gloria, but she's unable to because the judge tells her that they won't let her. But the judge doesn't reveal to Juliet who they are, and in this moment we find out that the judge isn't the one who's in control. Juliet once again takes things into her own hands and goes to her father, Dr. Nichols, for help. He agrees to sneak Gloria away into the nursery so Juliet can question her, and we also discover that there aren't any listening devices in the nursery. Dr. Nichols gives Gloria something to reverse the sedative, and Gloria begins to tell us that Juliet's father, Dr. Nichols, is one of them, and how he can't be trusted. She also reveals how she was the one that gave the book to George's mom, Anne, as we saw in the book last episode. Then she goes on to tell Juliet about the Flamekeepers, and how after the rebellion the silo put something in the water so everyone's memories of the past would fade. So basically the Flamekeepers were a group of people who tried to preserve the past, and we find out that Gloria was one of them. George's mom was also a Flamekeeper, and the silo prevented the rest of them from having children, along with people who are considered to be too smart, basically anyone who would start asking questions. Gloria also tells Juliet about the ocean, but she has never been there. She has only imagined herself being there, which is what we see in the opening of episode 7. Then we find out that George's mom helped Juliet's mom make a magnifying device, but she wasn't a Flamekeeper, just an associate. Gloria mentions that Holston came to see her and he put flowers in front of the mirror. At the end of the episode, Juliet figures out that Holston did what he did because he found out that they are being watched. And then the episode ends with Juliet finding the hard drive that Holston hid in the vent in Gloria's room, and we find out that Juliet's mom, Hanna, killed herself. Episode 8 begins with showing us a flashback of Juliet and her mom Hanna in the cornfield as she meet up with a farmer. We see her trading a drug for what we assume is a relic, until Juliet tells her mom later that we're not going to eat it, and she comments on how it's barely moving. And from the context, we can assume that it is some sort of small animal. Back in current day, we see Judicial as they search for Juliet. Robert goes to question Gloria about Juliet, and we can see that Gloria remembers him. During this time, we find out that Gloria is the reason why Robert's wife was able to give birth because she helped them when they were having complications. Robert goes on to basically threaten Gloria with solitude if she refuses to help him. Then she tells him that Juliet pulled a bag from the vent that Sheriff Holston put there. Then he asked what was in it and they cut away before she responds. Afterwards, Robert has her drugged again. As he searches for Juliet, she tries to find out what's on the hard drive. Then we cut back to her mom, Hanna, who's seen using some kind of microscope, and we see that she thinks that there is a small hole in the rabbit's heart. She attempts to find it and sew it up so she can perform a similar surgery on Jacob. This is the reason why she needs the microscope, so she is able to find the small hole. Back in current day, Juliet heads back to the sheriff's station to find out that Judge Meadows ordered a search for unregistered relics. Then in a flashback, we can see that they searched Juliet's home when she was a kid to find the microscope, and how Hanna blamed Peter for Judicial finding out about the device. But of course, at this time, they weren't aware of the cameras in their homes. Hanna eventually surrenders the device and of course they destroy it. Back in current day, they also search Juliet's bag and find nothing. Later, Juliet reveals to Paul that she doesn't think that Judge Meadows is the one calling the shots and how instead she thinks that it's Robert. Juliet and Paul then go to confront Robert to arrest him for breaking Pact investigation protocol. During this time, she discovers her mom's file in a secret compartment in Robert's office. Afterwards, she goes to see her father and finally apologizes for blaming him for her mother's death all these years. Then we cut to Martha, who receives an email from Juliet's father saying, "Runaway heading to you, urgent ETA 6 p.m. This is a coded message because they know they're being watched, and he has to make it seem as if he's warning her that a runaway is coming, but he's really just letting her know that Juliet is on the way. The clock shows 7:05 and Martha knows that something is wrong because Juliet hasn't arrived. She checks outside, but she's afraid to leave because if I haven't mentioned it already, Martha basically has agoraphobia. We're not really sure why just yet, but we know that she's afraid to leave her home. In the next scene, we see Lucas receiving a secret message from Juliet saying they need to talk. Lucas goes to meet her and she asks if anyone followed him and goes to turn on the faucet. She lets him know they've only got about 5 minutes until judicial raiders show up. Lucas is very confused, but she explains to him that she needs help accessing the files on the hard drive since he works in IT. He tells her that type of authorization is reserved for the head of IT and judicial, and it has to be plugged into a workplace computer which they don't have access to at the moment. She explains that the drive may hold the answers to questions like why Marnus and Johns were murdered, and what happened to George and Holston's wife. But Lucas is too afraid to break the rules, and Juliet loses her patience and breaks the mirror to reveal that they are being watched. She does this as an attempt to further convince Lucas, and in this moment he is pressured to make a decision, but unfortunately they run out of time because judicial is almost there. After she leaves, she runs into Mayor Bernard, and it seems as though he is trying to help her. He tells her that he knows a place where they can talk secretively, and that place is the cornfield. She reveals to Bernard that Robert is the one who is in control, and it's not Judge Meadows, but she doesn't know what he wants. In this moment, he reveals that he knows about the hard drive, but Juliet never told Mayor Bernard about the hard drive. And here's the big moment where we find out that he has been the one in control all this time, and he is the one who Judge Meadows is afraid of, not Robert. Mayor Bernard goes on to tell Juliet how he thinks he heard her say she wants to go outside. Of course, Juliet didn't say this, but this is how Mayor Bernard and Robert plan to get rid of her. He goes on to explain to her that the founders put the head of IT in control of the silo because for them to survive, the most intelligent and informative person would have to be the one in control. He tells her that she has been the biggest threat to the silo in 140 years. Juliet tries to run off and escape, but unfortunately she gets captured. At this time, we see a flashback of Juliet and her father at her mom's burial, and she felt like her mom was a coward for killing herself, and this is also where she releases the rabbit. Then we cut back to Martha as she gets the news about Juliet saying that she wanted to go out, but Martha believes it to be a lie because it is a lie. Back with Judicial, Juliet tries to tell Paul that she never said she wanted to go out, but Robert shuts her up. Soon after this, Juliet is able to escape once she sees that Paul is currently experiencing effects from the syndrome, and the episode ends with Juliet leaping off the edge of the staircase. Alright, so episode 9 picks up exactly where episode 8 left off, with Juliet jumping off the edge of the staircase. She gets away, and later Robert confronts Paul because he feels like he let her escape. Robert informs Mayor Bernard about the fact that he feels this way about Paul, and how he sent him home for the day. During this scene, we see a red key blinking on Bernard's desk with the number 18 on it, but at this time we do not know what this means. Also, throughout this episode, we continue to see Paul as he struggles with the syndrome. In the next scene, we see Hank at Martha's apartment as they continue to search for Juliet, and we also see Robert approaching Dr. Nichols as well, asking about her whereabouts. In the next scene, we finally find Juliet hiding in the most unlikely of places. She is at Robert's apartment, and this is where she handcuffs his wife in the kitchen and tries to access the hard drive. At this time, Paul goes and searches Juliet's apartment where he discovers the kid's travel guide Relic. And right now, Paul's plan is to track down Juliet and take her in to make things right, since Judicial believes that he allowed her to escape. Later, Mayor Bernard gets a hold of Lucas and threatens his freedom if he refuses to help them find Juliet. He tells them that he doesn't know much, but he does know that the hard drive she showed him had the number 18 on it. Later, we see Mayor Bernard as he takes this information back to IT, and they are able to track down Juliet's location based off the hard drive she plugged in. We find out that she's located on level 17 in apartment 114, and in this moment, Robert rushes over because we know that this is his place. At this time, we cut back to Juliet where she discovers a message that George left her. but she's interrupted by Robert's wife, who secretly escaped from the handcuffs while she was watching the video. Also, I'll just quickly mention that this is the first time Juliet has ever seen a video, because people in the silo aren't aware of the existence of video cameras. But anyway, Robert's wife informs Juliet that Judicial found her location the second she plugged in the hard drive, and she tells her that she can either finish watching the video or escape. Soon after this moment, Robert shows up, and we can see that Juliet is nowhere to be found. Not long after this, we find out that Juliet is now at Patrick Kennedy's apartment, where he helps her get in contact with a guy who is basically a hacker in the silo. Then we cut back to Paul, who's in tears after viewing the pages of the travel guide, because of course he now feels like everything that they've ever been told in the silo is a lie. At this time, he decides to rip out one page from the travel guide and tosses the rest in the oven to be destroyed. Back at Patrick's apartment, we find out that the hacker knows how to redirect Juliet's location to make it look like she's somewhere else in the silo. And in this moment, they're able to trick Judicial into thinking that she's now on level 98. She's finally able to watch the video, and here is where we find out the truth about George. He reveals that originally he was just going to use Juliet and leave, but he fell in love. He also tells her that he found the door underwater located in Dead Man's Hole, but he was unable to open it, and he tells her that maybe she can. Then the episode ends with Juliet watching the Jane Carmody cleaning video on the hard drive, and once again we see that beautiful video of the outside world, and we hear her telling everyone that the display in the cafeteria is a lie. So this concludes a basic recap of Silo episodes 1 through 9, and Nocturnal Critic will be back to handle the voiceover work for Silo's finale. He just needed a quick break after covering Season 2 of From. But anyway, thank you all for watching.
Check.